So for Fire Smart Landscaping, this is going to be the primary focus of the presentation. As I mentioned, I'm also going to be covering some aspects of the drought because it's obviously on people's minds at this point. But first, I do want to thank the Marin County Free Library and Linda Aldrich for being the hostess for this this presentation. And also acknowledge the assistance of, as Linda mentioned, Bob Maselli, a fellow master gardener who will be helping out in responding to any of the questions that come up in the chat. Let's see. A little bit of background on Master Gardeners. If you're not familiar with the program, we are volunteers and are trained by the UC Cooperative Extension, part of the UC, University of California system. And the intention is that we provide research-based information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscaping practices. We're taught by professionals who work for UC and in other positions. The focus is that we are presenting information that is science-based. And the idea is to get that out to the home gardener just as the professional gardeners and landscapers would get it directly from the UC extension. So our gardens are basically key for environmental health. And if you look at it from that point of view, we're trying to preserve and enhance the biodiversity of the environment and also be sensitive to any ecological considerations. In the case of fire smart landscaping and considering the drought, we also want to try to be as resilient as possible in order to still maintain the ecological sensitivity and the biodiversity. And at the same time, make it an enjoyable environment for us as the property owners. So what we'll plan on covering in this program today is some basic principles about resilient landscaping, specifically from a fire smart point of view, a little bit of background on some of the fire concerns, discuss some plant selection considerations on a very general level, specifically focus on defensible space zones around structures and the kinds of considerations as you look through those zones. And at the end, near the end, also includes some considerations from a drought point of view, and hopefully demonstrate that there are things that you can do in your yard that are both drought sensitive as well as fire smart. Hope that at the end be able to give you some specific suggestions of actions you can take as a result of this presentation to actually start taking some actions around your property. So the basic principles are that the plants in your landscape should be selected very carefully and maintained and kept hydrated on a regular basis. Very often, I know I've done it. You go to a garden center and you see something that you like, you decide to pick it up, and then you get home and try to figure out where you're going to put it. And probably need to be spending a little more time on the front end to figure out what it is, where you might want to place the plant, and then figure out the characteristics to match that location. One of the other considerations I know I haven't looked at very often is understanding the maintenance requirements of a particular plant. We'll talk a little bit about some of the considerations later. What's key is that each of our landscapes is unique in some way, based on size, on slope, other characteristics, and figuring out what plants fit within that environment can be very specific to your particular location. As we go through the presentation from a fire risk management point of view, I'll try to describe some of the things that are required by law, but I will tell you at the beginning that there are actually very few things that the law states that you need to do around your property. There are some, I'll cover it near the end, some myths that people have that they think are parts of the interpretation that might be law, when in fact they're not. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that the decisions we're making are based on science, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some information to help you in that decision process. Why is it more important now? I think we all realize that the climate has been changing and wildfires are becoming more frequent, intense, and destructive. To give you some idea, through another presentation, another master gardener had given, got a couple key points that I found interesting. So I live in southern Marin, Tam Valley, and I've been here for about 40 years. And I've sort of noticed what, in fact, the science has shown, that in San Francisco, in the summertime, from the early 1900s till now, there actually are 3 hours on average, 3 fewer hours of fog in the Bay Area now than there were 120 some odd years ago. Likewise, temperatures have gone up around an average of 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit in that same time period. So there's documentation that shows that things are changing in the climate. Wildfires are becoming more frequent, intense, and destructive. If you actually go to the CAL FIRE website and look at each of those categories, what you will find is that of the top 20 most destructive fires in California, 18 of those have occurred since 2000, and in fact, 6 of them occurred last year. In the case of the largest fires of the top 20, 17 since the year 2000, and 6 of them in 2020. So now add to that the concerns about drought. It's the second driest year in the case of the records for the Marin Water District, or Marin Water, and in fact the driest for North Marin Water District. So in terms of fire, just a background, you basically need 3 things to actually have a fire happen. Of that, and in the case of a fire in the wildland, there are 3 items that affect fire behavior. What's common to both of them is fuel. What people tend to think of as fuel is vegetation, when in reality it is anything that burns. It's obviously the trees and shrubs and perennials, but it's also landscape mulch. It's fencing, lawn furniture, and other items that are around the house or on your deck. And you need to sort of take a look at the property around your property to understand what things might be affected by the impact of fire. There are, from a fire professional point of view, they look at fire happening in 3 ways. One is direct flame contact. That is, something is burning and something next to that catches on fire because of the flames. And I think a lot of people believe that that's the way a lot of these mega fires happen, when in fact that's really not necessarily the case. The other exposure is through radiant heat, which is, a fire is so intense that something without flames touching it gets so hot that it itself combusts, and a fire starts in something adjacent. And there have been tests in the past that show what the distances are to make that happen. The final, and perhaps the most common reason for fires spreading, is through embers. You've probably heard this before. Embers can fly as far as 1 mile from a fire. And while they aren't as obvious as the other 2, with some kind of flame being apparent, they can be insidious in a way that they land in some small patch of debris on lawn furniture, a pile of leaves, and smolder for a while, eventually burst into flame, and whatever's nearby will end up catching on fire, and off we go. I'll just pass along one comment. If you haven't seen the Fire Safe Marin presentations, they ran a series of 5 workshops over the last month in May. There was actually a great conversation at the beginning of each one of those, about 12-minute video, that talks about the impact of of embers on a fire in the glass fire up in Santa Rosa in 2020. Very, very interesting to understand from a fire professional point of view of what actually ended up happening. So what we really want to be careful of is embers, and use the approach, focus on what are those things that we can do around our property to minimize the impact of embers starting a fire someplace on the property. So a couple scenarios just as a background. These are pictures from fire situations. So what you have in this case is a house that is standing perfectly sound with all the vegetation around it burned. It seems like an odd situation. We'll talk about some of the things that that property owner probably did in order to make that true. On the other hand, you've got just the opposite, where you've got a lot of green vegetation and a structure that is completely consumed. Again, some of the things we'll talk about will give you an idea of why each of these situations occurred. I want to cover a couple, what I'll call generic factors to consider, regardless of what you look at in the area around your property. One is to eliminate fuel ladders. That is, prevent a fire from starting. That may start on the ground, it gets into a shrub, and then eventually into trees, and then moving on maybe to adjacent trees and shrubs. And the whole idea of this is to try to keep spacing between different heights of plants. The rule of thumb in general is if you've got a plant of a certain height, you want to make sure that there's nothing above it within the 3 times that height. So if it's a plant is 1 foot high, make sure there's nothing within 4 feet from the ground of that plant in case that plant catches on fire. The other factor in general to consider is the impact of slope. You probably heard this, that fire is the only thing in nature that actually moves faster uphill, basically through preheating of whatever else is above where the fire actually exists. And what you want to do is increase the spacing depending on the increase in the slope. That's both in terms of spacing between the shrubs, but also spacing between the tree canopies, as shown in the case of shrubs on the left-hand side of this image, and in the case of tree canopies on the right-hand side. So let's talk a little bit about fire smart landscaping and the things that you need to consider. In general, regardless of where in your landscape you're looking at trying to improve the fire robustness or the fire resistance of your landscaping, one of the first things to do is just clean out all the dead and dying material that's around the property. We'll talk about defensible space zones in a minute and where to start first, but in general, this would apply anywhere within that defensible space area. You want to create islands of plants with some non-combustible separation between the islands. And the idea is that if once a fire starts in one section, it's more difficult for it to spread to another section. And by the way, if you do that, maintenance is also going to be a lot easier on your part to maintain the plants within those islands. Avoid any kind of planting or mulch that's really close to the structures, and we'll talk about what's called the ember resistance zone, which is at 0 to 5 foot distance around structures. And the idea is to basically minimize the risk of a fire starting in that area and then spreading to the structure. And as I mentioned earlier, you want to try to prune tree limbs up at least 6 feet or 1/3 the tree height if it's a shorter tree, to minimize the risk of fire going from a ground level up into the tree canopy. Well, one of the things that people often end up asking about is, well, what about plants? Can you tell me what plants to plant? What are fire resistant plants? What are the good guys I should be looking at? From a master gardener point of view, from a UC cooperative extension point of view, the consensus is there is nothing to indicate that one plant is necessarily any better than another from a scientific analysis point of view. The reality is, under different conditions and under the right conditions, all plants will burn. So the concern from both from a master gardener as well as a fire agency point of view is that putting a list together can be misleading, and it may encourage people to do things uh, that they shouldn't, and it may encourage some level of complacency that if I plant this plant, therefore I'm safe, when the reality is if you do that and you don't maintain it properly, don't keep it hydrated, you're probably going to get defeated in the case of a fire. What is most important is the placement of the plants, both within regards to plants that are nearby, next to each other, but also plants and other material above the one that you're planting to minimize fuel ladders. And then make sure you focus on maintenance, keeping the plant clean, minimizing dead material, pruning as appropriate, and if possible, doing the appropriate amount of hydration. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the considerations later, given the drought. So if you do decide you're going to do some planting, and right now our recommendation, our meaning Master Gardener recommendation, is trying to minimize that given the drought, but there may be reasons you want to do that. What you really want to think about is what's the long-term dimensions of that plant? How big will it grow? How wide will it get? How tall will it get? Clearly that affects maintenance from your point of view. Will you be able to reach it as it gets bigger? Also, if you've got any power lines nearby, are you going to influence or affect the power lines? Will it thrive, not just exist, but will it thrive where it's planted? Taking in factors of like, getting the proper amount of sun. Do you have the right amount of irrigation to support the plant? Will it require more maintenance on your part than maybe you're willing to do or able to do, or just based on its location, that's not possible to do? If you can't maintain it, and there's more of a risk of the plant getting a lot more dead material on the inside, becoming more of a fire risk. You may not spend as much time taking a look at it, making sure it's properly hydrated, and again, dry out sooner than you'd like, and again, become more of a fire risk. Well, is it something that's invasive that can affect the overall fuel load? I think a lot of us know the kinds of plants that are non-native that we want to avoid, but it's still a consideration depending on your particular location and the place you're going to plant an individual plant. And finally, how does that plant change over its lifespan? I'll give you an example. Somebody that I've seen on one of the streets near me, whose house is downhill from the street, planted a row of redwoods, probably 10 years ago, pretty much close to each other because they wanted to block the view. Well, those redwoods are now about 20 feet high. They're still about 4 or 5 feet apart, and they're basically, in my opinion, not particularly healthy because they're encroaching on each other given the size that they are. Not to say that they couldn't have done that from the beginning, but maybe part of the plan would have been, as the plants grew, to take out every other one over a period of time, so the ones that are remaining are not competing for the resources, nutrients, and the water that are available to all the plants. So we'll talk a little bit about defensible space zones. You've probably all seen a map similar to, or an image similar to this. And basically what we want to do is, if we're going to figure out a work plan to determine what we need to do around our property, the first place to start is at the home. If you talk to people at Fire Safe Marin, you talk to people at the fire agencies, they will actually talk about starting at the structure. Since we're focusing more on landscaping, we're going to assume you understand what some of those things are. Plus, a lot of those items can be, depending on what you need to do, can be expensive, like replacing windows, for example. So let's start at that 0 to 5 foot zone. And the intention there is to keep that area clean and as much as possible free from anything that's combustible. That includes plants. It includes things like a fence or a section of a fence. It could include various kinds of lawn furniture. Now, that doesn't mean you have to keep it that way 100% of the time. In the case of, for example, lawn furniture, it could be kept there for a period of time, but in red flag conditions, you may want to move it to get it away from that, get it out of that 0 to 5 foot zone. Then you move out to the next zone, which is 5 feet to 30 feet. And the idea is to make sure you have the right kind of plant spacing in that area. Minimize the amount of combustible mulch, wood mulch, for example. Generally have smaller plants in that area, and maybe in the case of the drought conditions, some of those plants are the ones you're going to focus on more from a watering point of view. Then you move out to the next zone, which is from 30 feet out to 100 feet. This is where you're getting much larger plants, maybe even a little bit closer together, bigger shrubs, doing things that just overall improve the aesthetics of your property. So some images and some more detail about that 0 to 5 foot zone. The intention is, if possible, like shown in this picture, if it's possible and reasonable from your point of view, to basically have that hardscaping in place, whether it's these bricks or stones, whatever, that's probably the most effective. If you're going to do any kind of planting, then what you want to do is make sure the plants are low. They're plants that will stay well hydrated when you do end up watering them, and minimize any plants that are under vents and under eaves or in front of windows. What you want to do is prevent anything that might catch on fire from causing the fire to then spread onto the structure. Be especially careful when you're looking at areas that are under or near decks, because the decks are considered part of the structure. As mentioned here, decorative rock or hardscape is the best thing to do. There are some laws going into effect soon in California about the 0 to 5 foot zone. They're rather indeterminate at this point in time of the exact requirements. But in general, what you want to do is try to keep the material in that 0 to 5 foot zone as non-combustible as possible. And if you want to start any one place around your property, this is the place to start, by looking at dead and dying material and picking that up and putting in your green bin. One of the items that is a requirement from a code point of view is removing all tree limbs 10 feet away from chimneys. The recommendation is also to keep those tree limbs 10 feet away from your structure and from the roof line. Some of the materials to consider, we've talked a little bit about this: stone, gravel, pavers, decomposed granite or DG. The preference from an ecological point of view is material that actually encourages any rain that does occur, or any watering that does occur, to get soaked into the ground and not run off. Clearly, anything that's a succulent would be an ideal kind of type of plant to put in this zone. It would demand less water. It'll probably stay hydrated longer than many other types of plants. And in general, they're probably more low growing than other types of plants. If you want to look at other types of species to consider, anything that is herbaceous, soft and flexible, that will retain water would be useful. One of the other factors to consider in this area, and again, going back to that workshop that Fire Safe Marin did the videos on, they actually showed cases where a fire started down the hill and basically spread up to a house and impacted a house by following a fence line. Now, it's not to say you should remove wooden fences around your property, but what you do want to do is create a break between the next, if you will, the next to the last section of a fence and the section that is attached to your house. And I just want to point out one item is in the bottom left picture. Looks like a solid wall. What that actually consists of is hardy board, which is a concrete composite. So you could conceivably, as shown in this picture, and I don't know if you'll be able to see with my cursor, this section of the fence line, perpendicular to what you're seeing in the photo, is a wooden fence line. This section in the front is the hardy board section. So essentially, you've created a break between what might happen if the wooden section catches fire. It's not going to spread along the hardy board. But you can also do the same thing by just simply having this last section, or if it's a gate, have that gate be a hardy board or a metal gate. And that would break up the continuity of the wooden fence adjacent to the structure. Some other things to consider if you want to just think of it from an aesthetic point of view, things that you could do. You could put in decorative rocks, larger rocks, to create a little pieces of interest. As mentioned earlier, permeable landscape, hardscaping, that will allow both for water percolation, but may again also provide some interest. And maybe even a fountain kind of recirculating water feature. If it's small enough, it may still be a viable thing to do even with the current drought conditions. When we go beyond, well, here's some examples of different ideas of that 0 to 5 foot zone. You've got a pathway here next to the house, probably decomposed granite here. In this case, it is not a lawn. It's actually a drought-tolerant grass that's put in. Will maintain its water retention characteristics with minimal watering. And in this example here down in the lower part in the middle is actually of an area around Bob Maselli's house, where he replaced some planting that was adjacent to the house, had the gravel installed here, but yet has heuchera and other plants right adjacent to that, and still provides a lot of interest to the front of the house. So you may say, well, why does it matter? And I think this picture sort of demonstrates this. This was actually taken from an area where there was a fire. That browned area, the darkened area here, basically was all wood mulch. As you can see, the plants that were planted next to the house got torched at the bottom levels, even with the wood mulch that was there. That fire was intense enough for these plants where it actually distorted the siding of the house. Unfortunately, this planting wasn't dense enough where it actually caused any damage inside the house, and maybe even ultimately causing the house to be totally destroyed. But it is an example of why you want to be careful within that 0 to 5 foot zone. When we get beyond that, things loosen up quite a bit. You can plant in islands. You've got a whole variety of plants that you can put in terms of mixing them up together. The emphasis from a master gardener point of view is to really strongly consider using California natives where at all possible. We'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute. The idea is that it's smaller shrubs, preferably herbaceous perennials. If you have a kitchen garden, herb garden, if you will, be a great place to do that. One of the things you want to consider, though, is make sure it's maintained properly, so that some of the plants like a lavender or rosemary doesn't get so woody that it becomes a concern. You want to make sure the tree, if there are trees, that they're okay. And again, focus on those areas first to make sure they're free of any dead material, ladder fuels, and do the general kind of maintenance that's necessary to keep the tree both healthy and attractive. The idea again behind all this is that when you're doing this, you're actually making all these areas more accessible for maintenance. To me, it's even though it's a ornamental kind of a garden, it's not a lot different than the edible gardeners do when they want to make sure they maintain their garden to access and get all the vegetables out of their garden. So you're doing the same thing, but you're doing it for a different kind of reason. Continuing on, so again, low growing, mostly perennials. If they're well maintained, that will mean that there's going to be less fuel, preferably rock mulching between the planting groups. That'll both help from a water infiltration point of view when there is any watering done and the rains will hopefully come. You want to keep this area well hydrated and plants that'll retain that water a little bit better than other areas so that you don't have to water it as much. And as I mentioned, hardscape is where possible closer to the house. When you go beyond the 30 feet, maybe you've got wider walkways that will help separate planting areas, again, to minimize the risk of fire spread. You want to, as with the other areas, regularly remove plant material. You may not do it as frequently here as you might do it in the 5 to 30 foot zone. Using wood mulch, leaving leaf litter is okay in this area. Having grasses of some form, whether it's a lawn or native grasses, is perfectly fine. You want to keep them mowed to minimize, again, the flame length getting too high. So mowing it or keeping it cut to like 4 inches is probably a wise thing to do. Also want to take a look as you walk around your property for the routes you would take, not to escape from a fire, but to get from your house to your car. Sometimes you may have an arbor or with plantings on an arbor, and it's part of the path to where your car is, or maybe it's 50 feet to get to your car, and that last 10 feet is just really dense vegetation. Well, you want to make sure that that is as clean as possible, so that in case you do need to leave for any kind of a fire risk, that you're not threatened by a fire actually starting in that nearby vegetation to the escape route. Here's a couple pictures of some examples of California natives in that 30 to 100 foot zone. Larger islands, a lot of space, where appropriate space in between. Look at things like this rock wall, for example, as also basically a fire break. Not only is it horizontal with the path, but as a vertical wall can provide somewhat of a fire break from a fire, other than these plants hanging over the side, but it does provide some kind of a fire break from the fire spreading from one level to another. I've mentioned mulch. There's actually a study that was done by the University of Nevada looking at 8 different kinds of mulch and their combustibility. The general consensus is that a composted wood mulch is reasonably acceptable to use when you're talking in that, towards the 30 foot and beyond area. Regardless of where you are in your property, you want to minimize or avoid the use of gorilla hair, that really fine material. And I'll mention in a minute the reason why. Avoid organic mulches where possible within that 0 to 5 foot zone. And if you do have mulched areas, have some non-combustible material separating those mulched areas. Going back to the gorilla hair again, and that my comment about the workshops in one of the videos. If you do get a chance to look at that, there's one section where a firefighter says that in the case of this glass fire, that a fire crew spent a long time basically opening up an area that had a lot of gorilla mulch, where a fire was actually in almost underground. It was, the gorilla mulch was very thick, and they just spent a lot of time trying to spread the mulch out in order to get it watered down and actually to remove the risk of any kind of a fire. So there are a number of reasons why you really want to avoid using that. So in summary, ideally what you have is 0 to 5 feet non-combustible mulch. 5 to 30, you have composted wood chips or composted mulch with some separation between islands of non-combustible material, and then using larger wood mulch in the area 30 feet and beyond. Generally try to keep the mulch less than 2 inches deep. As I mentioned with the gorilla hair example, but it could be true even with the larger mulches. That'll minimize the risk of a fire just sort of smoldering in really, really deep mulch. So let's talk about this, maybe a work plan, if you will, for your yard. Really consists of these 4 categories. And you can almost look at them as a sequence that you could follow. You want to do some cleanup where at all possible. Look at the water situation and what plants should be getting watered. While you're doing that, look at using mulch where appropriate to keep the water moisture in the ground as much as possible, and then factor in any kind of pruning that would be appropriate. And part of the reason the pruning is a little bit later is that depending on the plants, there may be different times of the season that are more appropriate for pruning particular species of plants. So for the cleanup, basically, just get rid of the stuff that shouldn't be there, that you would prefer not being there. Everything from pulling weeds so they're not competing for the nutrients and water in the yard, raking up the leaves and needles from what gets dropped from the trees nearby. One area to look at is also look at your gutters and rooftops. One item, if you wanted to put together a to-do list, is maybe in August or September, is having somebody clean out the gutters and the rooftop for any debris, not necessarily for the hopeful winter rains, but to minimize any kind of risk of fire starting in that area and any debris that's in the gutters or on the roof. Remove anything under the deck. You don't want a fire to start in some material that's underneath that ends up spreading to the deck. As we get more into the fire season, avoid mowing on hotter, windy days. If you do have grassy areas, whether it's a lawn or more wild grass, if you need to do any kind of mowing or cutting, do it early in the morning when it's cooler and hopefully less windy. The ideal is that your wood piles are at least 30 feet away from structures. Again, that goes back to the guideline that even if you have a really intense fire within 30 feet, it's going to be very difficult for a fire to get started on an adjacent structure that's 30 feet away just from radiant heat. At all possible, combustible items away from the house. This can be very difficult to do on an ongoing basis, but maybe as part of a checklist that you have in case of a red flag day, for example, to move lawn furniture around, or your debris bins so they're further away from structures on your property. And it would also apply to generators that you want to keep them quite a distance away from structures and at least 10 feet away from plants. You've probably seen these pictures. Just if you compare the two of them, you've got a before in the upper left. It just shows a lot of conditions that would be high fire risk for that particular environment. And what you want to do is clean that up, open things up, provide some distance between different plants so that you end up with a picture that's closer to what you see in the bottom right. Not a lot of vegetation near the structures, and then spacing between the vegetation islands. For watering, it's going to be important to maintain your irrigation system. I'm almost of the opinion at this point, given the drought conditions, that instead of actually spending time looking at doing a lot of planting, maybe that time is better spent by looking at the irrigation system and figuring out what changes might be appropriate based on plants you want to emphasize and make sure they are maintained properly through this drought period. Keeping those plants properly hydrated, and again, closer to the house, having more of a focus, will not only reduce the risk of provide fire resistance, but also reduce the risk of any pests or diseases. In the case of pruning, and I mentioned this earlier, you really need to look at some of the species, the appropriate time to do pruning. And for example, you don't want to do pine trees during the summer. You want to wait till the winter time. On the other hand, in the case of oaks, the California native oaks, they tend to go dormant in the summertime. It might be a better time to do some pruning for those trees. But as a general guideline, branches away from your chimneys and roof. Focus first on the dead or diseased or dying branches. If you've been involved in pruning at all, people talk about avoiding, minimizing crossing branches. That would be another thing to consider doing as you're looking at plants in your yard. I mentioned limbing up trees at least 6 feet or 1/3 the height of the tree if it's a shorter tree. And please don't top any kind of tree, and I don't care what kind it is. It generally will cause excessive branching and growth at the lower levels. If you look at some other trees, it actually will create what are called witches' brooms at the top. Basically, the plant will react in a way that says, well, you've cut off a certain part of me. I'm going to basically replace it in one way or another, but it's going to be a lot denser and risky than what was there originally. It may be a case of the wrong plant in that particular location if topping is something that you need to consider. I mentioned escape routes, just a checklist, and this was actually covered in a Fire Safe Marin presentation that was done by another master gardener in late May, I believe. Basically understand the escape routes to your vehicle. If you're going to go around, look at your yard, take a look at those. Try to have 2 ways out from your house to the vehicle, and make sure it's a path that you can get to and get through easily without any risk from if a fire's actually started somewhere in your yard. Look at the conditions of all the plants along that route and to do the guidelines that I mentioned about defensible space to make sure that those plants are healthy and that the risk of them actually catching on fire and being a risk to you is minimized, and that's probably by doing a lot of maintenance. So in the back of your mind, I've talked about fire smart landscaping and talked a little bit about the water issue. But you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, how can we do this given the drought? What are things that I should be doing in my yard given the drought conditions? Well, again, in that same presentation that talked about escape routes by Fire Safe Marin, this is an extract of some of the material that was also covered in that presentation. Essentially, what you want to do is establish priorities. Be that the trees that are newer, ones that maybe you planted last October, hoping that it was going to be a rainy season, trees that are more mature, trees that are basically providing some other benefit, as fruit trees or nut trees. and those become your priority. Other trees, you may say, well, I'm not going to, if I'm going to risk something, it'll be some other plant. You can go down the list and look at the same kind of triage, if you will, for vegetables, ground covers, and in some cases, you may actually look at some plants and say, well, maybe that particular one needs to be removed. It's appropriate to get it out. It might basically create a little bit of a break between other plants in case a fire does start. Adjust your watering practices. Take a look at your watering system. Maybe there needs to be some adjustments in timing. Maybe you need to change the zones if you've got a drip system, so that the plants that you prefer keeping are being favored from a watering point of view. If you do have some plants that are sort of isolated, if you will, maybe the solution is you actually do hand watering. And if you decide you're going to be doing some planting, maybe that's the way you handle it for anything new that you decide to put into the yard. Use mulch to retain the moisture, and for sure you want to keep the weeds out, because they're just going to compete for the nutrients in the water that's in the ground for the plants that you would prefer keeping. The recommendation would be to avoid new plantings, and for sure avoid fertilizing, or at least over fertilizing. If the plants are fertilized too much, basically they're going to want to grow more, which is, you almost want to have them go into some kind of a slowdown period with less water, and minimize their demand for both water and nutrients at this point. Well, if you do want to consider new plants, think back to the things I mentioned earlier about the items I mentioned about placement and maintenance. Strongly evaluate the water needs of the plants, and then also other environmental factors, the benefits to pollinators, biodiversity. There are a variety of plants from a California native point of view that would be very worthwhile planting and beneficial to the environment versus things that are non-native. And the reality is, fall is the best time to plant. Again, hoping that there's going to be more rain and water later this year. Maybe you spend the time between now and September and August to plan on what you would want to replace or change in your yard, and getting ready for that, acquiring and putting in those new plants. So from a drought point of view, the summary is: evaluate the landscape around your property, prioritize the plants that you consider most valued, consider changing your practices in terms of whether you put in new landscaping, what the amount of fertilizing you're doing, and the irrigation that you're doing in the yard. Keep the moisture that's in the ground in by using more mulch and compost. When you're looking at a safe landscape, consider looking at your escape zones to your car, and do that on a zone-by-zone basis from a defensible space point of view. Assess the health and conditions of your plants. I know that, for example, in Tam Valley, there's a lot of Monterey pines that are very much health stressed. My take would be it might be better to remove those at this point and not try to keep them, because I'm not sure that in many cases they're going to survive much longer, even through this year, even if the drought ended this year. Apply the defensible space guidelines, and the key point here is do the appropriate maintenance. So I want to mention a couple myths real briefly. And again, I'm just going to reference, these are taken actually from a Fire Safe Marin video about landscaping in defensible space. I'm just going to point out two key things. One is that some people think that being fire smart means I remove all vegetation. That is absolutely not true, and that is not what the fire professionals will recommend. Part of that is people saying, well, I really need to cut down trees. Hopefully, by going through this presentation, you've learned that the place you need to be most concerned is adjacent to your structures. And that tree that's 20 feet away, 100 feet away, or on your neighbor's property is less of a concern from a fire risk point of view than what is adjacent to your property. If those trees are properly maintained, limbed up, there's not a fuel ladder nearby, chances are they're going to do perfectly well, like some of the pictures I showed earlier. What's also important, and I look at the third item from the bottom, landscapes are not beautiful. The reality is, especially if you look at the California natives, there are a lot of California natives that need very little water. In fact, there's a whole list of them that you don't even want to water in the summertime. I have run through that experience myself. I had some, if you're familiar with it, it's called a Vermontodendron that periodically got watered, and it basically in 1 year died. It is one plant that you do not want to water at all in the summertime. A lot of the plants, like some of the Ceanothus species, for example, are very similar. And if there is any watering done, it is very, very minimal. So you can have both a beautiful landscape as well as one that's very drought tolerant. The other myth is that you need to do it all now. This is not a case of you go out there and hire all sorts of people to do work. There's a lot of work that you can do on your own and do it on a step-by-step basis over the next couple of weeks and months. We've covered a lot of this. So, if you need a list, this is a good list to just take a look at. Get rid of the combustible material in that 0 to 5 foot zone. If any plants, make sure they're low growing and well watered, and just maintain all the plants throughout your landscape. In purpose of time, we've covered a lot of this. So in summary, I'd like to say that I think a fire smart sustainable landscape can be both beautiful, safe, and can save water and support the wildlife. The key is start at the house and work out. That's the place to look first. And especially in that ember resistant and ember defense zone. Placement and design are important at the beginning, but then maintenance on an ongoing basis is essential. So what if you asked me for a list of what to do? So basically I'd say, especially with the weekend, do what I'm going to call a property walkabout. Just take a notebook and, depending on the time of day, some kind of beverage, and just walk around, take notes, grab some photos, and say, well, what do I need to change? What could be done to improve this, looking from the structure on out? On that list, things like cleaning up debris and vegetation within the first 5 feet should be at the top of the list. And then make plans for the next step. For almost all of Marin, through the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority and Fire Safe Marin, there are chipper days going on right now. There's another set of chipper days later in the year, I think starting in August. If there are some larger materials that you want to remove, plan on doing that work just prior to the chipper day. So your effort is basically doing the cutting and getting it out in time for the chipper day that's scheduled for your neighborhood. If there's other stuff that's going on in the meantime, use your green bin. I know where I live, the local garbage service encourages, or at least doesn't discourage, people from sharing green bins. You could even work with your neighbors and on a rotating basis of a couple weeks, clean up 1 yard at a time and use multiple green bins to get rid of the material that you clean up in the yard. Basically, keep calm, make a plan, and then follow the plan. And so I just want a couple quick things from my point of view. I did that walkabout. I identified some things. I still got some more work to do to put that list together. And then I want to work the list, and I just want to show you that the process is gradual. Here's just a couple photos. Basically, pile of leaves in a corner and some rocks. So I've got that 0 to 5 feet, except for the fact that it's not particularly clean. So I'd clean that up. This is an oak tree that's below our deck in our backyard. I want that tree to get bigger, and I've talked to the fire agency about it. If I keep that thing pruned and cleaned up, I want it to get bigger, and it's not going to be necessarily the thing that's going to threaten the house. On the other hand, different view, this ceanothus, I planted a couple years ago. It was actually beautiful. For a variety of reasons, it was probably not the right plant at that location, not to mention the fact of it not being a particularly good plant given its size next to the deck and the house. I left it there until the flowers were gone, because it was just completely covered with both native and honeybees. And basically for the chipper day that happened a couple weeks ago, I had got it taken out, and that's the way it looks now. So there are things you can do, excuse me, gradually, but let's keep in touch. And these are ways you can reach the Master Gardeners and their help desk. Right now it's by email. Hopefully sometime later this year, you'll be able to go in person at the Nevada Boulevard location. But right now, if you've got any questions, send an email to Master Gardeners. Thank you.
Thank you. So I know Bob's been answering the questions in the chat. If anyone has any more questions, ask them now. Otherwise,
just a couple of comments on some of the questions. You can only type so fast. There was a question on about a plastic shed, and was that something that could cause a fire danger? And my answer to that was to contact your fire agency. They've got folks called Defensible space examiners who can come out and give you the kind of advice on site that requires. And the other two questions, one was on someone who had cleaned up their place, but their neighbor hadn't, and they wanted to know what they could do. And what they could do is just talk to their neighbor. And do it in a friendly and helpful way, and make some suggestions that they could do. Most neighbors, if done in a friendly and helpful way, will react to that. You could also recommend to that neighbor that they request a visit from a defensive space examiner from their fire agency to help them develop a plan to do that. These folks are trained. In fact, I was one of the trainers to a group of them, and they are not there to be kind of like a Gestapo. They are there to be helpful. So I'd recommend that wherever you are in Marin County.
well, I don't see any more questions. Jim and Bob, thank you so very much for all the great information. And if anybody wants to hear this again, it will be on the Marin County YouTube site in about a week. Thank you so much for attending, and have a good weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.